The London fog of 1812 was a living thing, a thick, amber-tinted curtain that swallowed the grand townhouses of Mayfair and muffled the frantic beating of Lady Genevieve's heart. Inside the sprawling drawing-room of the Cavendish estate, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax, expensive brandy, and the metallic tang of desperation. Genevieve stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers tracing the cold glass. She was a woman of striking contrasts. Her hair was the color of midnight, a deep, lustrous raven black that fell in heavy waves down her back, and her skin possessed the creamy pallor of fine porcelain. To the ton, she was a statue of elegance, but today, she felt like a lamb being readied for the altar. Her family's legacy, spanning 5 centuries, was crumbling. Her father's ill-advised investments in the shipping trade had vanished beneath the Atlantic waves, and now, the only thing left to trade was Genevieve herself. The man who had bought her future was not a man of soft words or gentle glances. Cillian O'Shea, the Duke of Rathmore, was a figure of legendary intimidation. A man of Irish descent who had clawed his way into the highest echelons of British society through military brilliance and ruthless land acquisition, Cillian was unlike any other peer. Most notable was his hair, a vibrant, fiery copper that seemed to burn with a life of its own, echoing the untamed spirit the English lords so feared. He was tall, broader than most, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from the rugged cliffs of his homeland. His eyes were a piercing, stormy gray, capable of freezing a man's blood with a single look. When he had arrived at the Cavendish home to settle the marriage contract, he hadn't even looked at the paintings or the gold leaf. He had looked only at Genevieve, with a gaze that was clinical, detached, and utterly devoid of warmth. The deal had been struck in a room filled with shadows. "I require a duchess who understands the value of silence and the necessity of an heir," Cillian had stated, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried the faint, dangerous edge of a Dublin accent. "I do not have time for the trivialities of romance, Lady Genevieve. I do not want a companion for my soul, for I gave that up on the battlefields years ago. I want a woman who will grace my table, manage my estates, and ask nothing of my heart. In return, your father's debts are erased, your sisters are provided for, and you shall have every jewel in the Rathmore vault. Is that a price you are willing to pay for your family's salvation?" Genevieve had looked into those stormy gray eyes, framed by that shock of red hair, and she had nodded. "I accept, Your Grace. I expect nothing more than what you have offered." But as the weeks passed leading up to the wedding, the coldness of their arrangement began to seep into her bones. Cillian was a ghost in his own courtship. He sent flowers, but no notes. He provided a carriage, but never rode in it with her. The London gossips whispered that the flame of Rathmore had a heart of ice, and that Genevieve was merely the newest piece of furniture in his cold, vast mansion. On the morning of the wedding, the sun refused to break through the clouds. Genevieve was dressed by 4 maids in a gown of silver-threaded silk that made her raven hair pop with an almost ethereal intensity. She looked like a queen, but she felt like a prisoner. As she was whisked toward the royal chapel, the streets were lined with onlookers curious to see the union of the Black Raven and the Red Duke. The interior of the chapel was a cathedral of silence. Thousands of white roses had been arranged in cascading walls, their scent so thick it was dizzying. Cillian stood at the altar, his red hair gleaming like a beacon under the dim chandelier light. He looked magnificent and terrifying, his dress uniform tight across his broad shoulders, his expression a mask of stony indifference. As Genevieve walked down the aisle, her father's hand trembling on her arm, she didn't look at the guests. She kept her eyes on Cillian. She looked for a crack, a sign, a glimmer of anything other than duty. But he remained as still as a mountain. The ceremony began with a solemnity that felt more like a funeral than a wedding. The Archbishop's voice droned on, speaking of the sanctity of marriage, while Genevieve felt her soul retreating further into herself. When the time came for the exchange of rings, Cillian took her hand. His touch was electric, a sudden, jarring warmth that sent a shock through her entire body. He slid the heavy Rathmore emerald onto her finger, his eyes never leaving hers. And then, the moment arrived. It was the tradition of the Rathmore dukes to deliver a public vow of intent at the altar, a tradition Cillian had previously told her he would keep brief and functional. The congregation leaned forward, expecting a sentence or two about lineage and property. Cillian took a deep breath, and for the first time, his composure seemed to falter. The stony mask didn't just crack, it shattered. He didn't look at the Archbishop. He didn't look at the Duke of Wellington or the princes in the front row. He leaned in toward Genevieve, his voice dropping to a register that was intimate, raw, and devastatingly honest. "Genevieve," he began, and the sound of her name in his voice made her breath catch in her throat. "I brought you here under a false pretense. I told you I wanted a marriage of stone and silence. I told you I had no heart left to give, and that I only sought a partner for my title. I lied." A collective gasp echoed through the stone chamber. The red-headed duke, known for his ruthless pragmatism, was trembling. "The truth is, I have spent every night since our first meeting haunted by the light in your eyes. I was so afraid of the power you held over me, the way your spirit made me feel the weight of my own loneliness, that I tried to bury you in a contract. I promised you a loveless marriage because I was a coward, too terrified to admit that I was already a slave to the very thought of you. Today, I do not just take you as my duchess. I ask you, in front of God and every man here, to forgive me for my silence. I do not want a partner in name, I want to spend every breath I have left proving that this loveless marriage was the greatest lie ever told." The silence that followed was absolute. Genevieve felt the tears she had suppressed for weeks finally break free, shimmering against her dark lashes. The man she thought was made of ice was burning with a fire far brighter than his hair. But as she opened her mouth to respond, a shadow fell across the altar. The great doors of the chapel were thrown open, and a woman dressed in tattered black lace, her face veiled and her hands shaking, stepped into the light, holding a bundle that let out a sharp, piercing cry. The scandal of the century had just arrived at the moment of his greatest confession. The silence that followed Cillian's confession was not the peaceful kind, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the royal chapel. Genevieve stood frozen, her hands still encased in Cillian's large, warm palm. His thumb was tracing slow, unconscious circles over her knuckles, a gesture so tender it felt like a betrayal of the cold man she thought she had married. But the woman at the back of the church, the shadow in tattered lace, was a physical manifestation of a past Genevieve didn't know. The infant's cry pierced the air again, sharp and demanding, echoing off the high stone arches like a siren of doom. Cillian's grip on Genevieve's hand tightened, but his eyes stayed fixed on hers for a heartbeat longer, as if he were trying to memorize her face before his world ended. Then, slowly, he turned. The vibrant copper of his hair seemed to dull under the flickering candlelight as he faced the intruder. The congregation was a sea of shifting silk and frantic whispers. Lady Cavendish, Genevieve's mother, had gone pale, her fan fluttering like a dying bird's wing. The scandal was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. "Speak," Cillian commanded. His voice had lost the raw vulnerability of his vow and returned to that low, dangerous rumble that commanded battlefields. "Who are you to interrupt a holy union under the king's eye?" The woman stepped forward, her boots clicking hollowly on the marble floor. She threw back her veil with a trembling hand, revealing a face that was young but ravaged by grief and poverty. She looked like a ghost of the Irish countryside. "I am Mary O'Shea," she cried out, her voice thick with an accent that mirrored Cillian's own, though hers was jagged with pain. "And this child is the blood of your blood, Cillian. You left us in the mud of Kildare to chase titles and English gold. You promised my sister a life, and you gave her a grave instead." Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. Blood of his blood. She looked at Cillian, searching for a denial, a flash of righteous anger. Instead, she saw a flicker of profound, ancient guilt cross his stormy gray eyes. He didn't look like a duke in that moment, he looked like a man who had seen his own soul mirrored in a mirror he tried to smash years ago. "Mary," Cillian said, and the name was a weary sigh. "Your sister died of the fever. I sent the money. I sent for the doctors. Money cannot hold a child. Money cannot keep the cold from the bones." Mary shrieked, holding the crying infant toward the altar. "You sit here in silk and diamonds, marrying a lady who doesn't know the smell of peat smoke, while your own nephew has no name but bastard." The scandal was complete. A duke with a hidden past, a secret family, and a debt of honor that silk could not cover. Genevieve felt the eyes of the entire town on her back, the pitying glances, the hidden smirks of rivals who delighted in her humiliation. Her father stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "Rathmore! Explain this at once. My daughter will not be part of this Irish melodrama." But Cillian didn't look at the Earl. He turned back to Genevieve. The fire in his hair seemed to match the intensity of his gaze. "Genevieve," he whispered, so low only she could hear. "I told you I was a coward. I told you I had buried my heart. This is the weight of the man you are marrying. I am not the polished peer they see. I am a man of shadows and broken promises. If you walk away now, no one will blame you. I will settle your father's debts regardless. I will not hold you to a contract signed in blood and lies." Genevieve looked at him. She looked at the raw honesty in his face, the way his red hair seemed to burn against the backdrop of the cold, gray church. She looked at the woman in the back, a symbol of the life he had escaped, or perhaps abandoned. Everyone expected her to faint. They expected her to flee, to cry, to demand an annulment. But Genevieve was a woman of midnight and steel. She took a step closer to Cillian, her silver gown shimmering like moonlight on a dark lake. "Is the child yours, Cillian?" she asked, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the chapel. "He is my sister's son," Cillian replied, his voice breaking. "My sister, who I could not save. He is the last of my line that doesn't carry a title. He is all that is left of who I was before I became this." He gestured to his expensive uniform. Genevieve took a deep breath. She reached out and took his hand again, her dark hair contrasting sharply with the pale ivory of her veil. "Then we shall not leave him in the cold." She turned toward the congregation, her gaze sweeping over the shocked nobles with the authority of a woman who had already claimed her crown. "The ceremony will continue. The Duke of Rathmore has found his family today, and as his Duchess, I shall welcome his kin into our home. If there is any among you who finds charity a scandal, then you are not welcome at our table." The Archbishop, stunned into silence, looked from the Duke to the bride. Cillian looked at Genevieve as if he were seeing a miracle. The Ice Duke didn't just melt, he burned with a devotion that was terrifying in its scope. He leaned down, ignoring the whispers and the woman at the back, and kissed Genevieve's hand with a reverence that felt like a prayer. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of shock. They were pronounced husband and wife, but as they walked out of the chapel, the world was waiting to tear them apart. The woman, Mary, was taken to the Duke's carriage, and the infant was wrapped in a Rathmore cloak. But as Genevieve climbed into the carriage beside her new husband, the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the storm roll in. "Why did you do it?" Cillian asked as the carriage jolted forward. His red hair was disheveled, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. You could have been free. You could have walked away with your reputation intact and your father's gold secured. Genevieve looked at the man who had promised her a loveless marriage only to confess his soul at the altar. Because, Cillian, she said softly, you promised me a house without fire. But I think I would rather burn with you than freeze alone in a palace of lies. And because I think the Red Duke needs someone to remind him that he is not the only one who knows how to fight for what belongs to him. But as they reached Rathmore House, a new threat was waiting. A carriage with the royal seal stood at the gates. The king's messenger stepped forward, a grim expression on his face. Your Grace, he said, bowing to Cillian. The king has heard of the irregularities at the chapel. He requires your presence at Carlton House immediately. There are questions regarding the legitimacy of your Irish holdings and the nature of your service to the crown. It seems your past has not just come for your heart, but for your head. Cillian's face turned to stone. He looked at Genevieve, then at the baby in Mary's arms. The battle for their marriage had only just begun, and the price was no longer just a heart, it was their lives. The journey from the royal chapel to Carlton House felt like a descent into a different kind of purgatory. Inside the confines of the luxury carriage, the air was thick with the scent of Genevieve's floral perfume and the metallic, sharp odor of Cillian's anxiety. Outside, the London streets were a blur of grey stone and judgmental faces. The news of the Red Duke scandal was likely already spreading through the coffee houses and salons like a wildfire in a dry forest. Genevieve sat perfectly upright, her dark hair stark against the velvet cushions, her hands folded over her silver skirts. She looked every bit the Duchess, but internally, she was mapping out a battlefield. Cillian leaned his head against the wood paneling, his fiery red hair messy and unkempt, a silent rebellion against the rigid expectations of his rank. They will try to strip the title, he murmured, his voice sounding hollow. The king is a man of tradition, and my enemies have been waiting for a crack in my armor since the day I returned from the war. An unacknowledged child, a sister left in poverty, it's the ammunition they need to claim I am unfit for the peerage. He turned his stormy gray eyes toward her, and for a moment, the fierce warrior was replaced by a man who was utterly lost. I have dragged you into a ruin, Genevieve. I promised you a name that would protect you, and now that very name is a target. Genevieve reached out, her pale hand covering his. A name is only as strong as the person who carries it, Cillian. You are not a duke because of a piece of parchment, you are a duke because you held the line when others fled. If the king wants a villain, let him look at the men who whispered in the pews today, not the man who stood at the altar and spoke the truth. Her voice was a calm anchor in his storm. We will face Carlton House together. You are the Red Duke, and I am the woman who chose to stand by your side when the world turned cold. They cannot take that from us. When they arrived at the Prince Regent's residence, the opulence of the setting felt mocking. Gold leaf dripped from the ceilings, and massive portraits of ancestors who had never known a day of true hardship looked down with disdain. They were ushered into a private withdrawing room, where the air was heavy with the smell of expensive tobacco and port. Lord Castlereagh, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, stood by the fireplace. Your Grace, Castlereagh began, his voice like silk over a blade. And the new Duchess. A fascinating wedding, to be sure. It is not often the royal chapel is used for such a vivid display of Irish history. The prince is disturbed. There are rumors that your estates in Kildare were not inherited, but seized through means that the crown might find questionable. And now, this child. It suggests a lack of character that the Regency cannot ignore. Cillian stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking Genevieve from Castlereagh's predatory gaze. The copper of his hair seemed to glow with a dangerous intensity under the chandeliers. My character was forged in the mud of Spain, Lord Castlereagh, while you were deciding which cravat best suited the afternoon. The child is my nephew, the son of a woman who gave her life while I was serving the king's interests abroad. If the crown finds loyalty and family responsibility questionable, then perhaps the crown has forgotten what holds a kingdom together. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Genevieve knew that one wrong word could lead to exile. She stepped around Cillian, her presence commanding attention. "My lord," she said, her voice echoing with the grace of generations of Cavendish ancestors. "As a daughter of this land, I can assure you that the Cavendish name does not align itself with anything less than honor. I have seen the Duke's heart today, a heart he tried to hide even from me. What you call a scandal, I call the highest form of integrity. He chose to protect a helpless child at the cost of his own reputation. Is that not the very definition of a gentleman? If the Regency moves against him, they move against the woman who has just pledged her life to his cause. And I assure you, my father's friends in the House of Lords will find that narrative very compelling." Castlereagh narrowed his eyes, clearly surprised by the steel in the young Duchess's voice. He looked at the raven-haired woman and the red-headed giant, a pair that should have been broken by the day's events, but instead seemed forged into something indestructible. He let out a short, dry laugh. "You have a formidable wife, Rathmore. Perhaps she is the shield you've always lacked." "She is not my shield," Cillian replied, his voice softening as he looked at Genevieve. "She is my reason." They were dismissed, but the victory was temporary. As they returned to the carriage, the reality of their situation began to set in. They had the child, they had the title for now, but they were isolated. When they finally reached Rathmore House, the grand doors were opened by a staff that looked terrified. Inside, the infant was being cared for by Mary, who looked out of place among the marble statues and velvet drapes. Cillian led Genevieve to the master suite. The room was vast, with a fire roaring in the hearth, casting long shadows against the walls. For the first time that day, they were truly alone, not as a duke and duchess, but as a man and a woman bound by a lie that had turned into a terrifying truth. Cillian stood by the fire, his back to her, his hands gripping the mantelpiece. "I didn't think I would survive today," he said quietly. "I thought the weight of the past would finally crush me. And then you stood there." "Why, Genevieve? You knew the bargain. You could have let me fall and kept the money." Genevieve walked up behind him, her silver dress rustling on the carpet. She didn't stop until she was inches away from him. "I told you, Cillian. You promised me a house without fire. But I have spent my whole life in cold rooms, surrounded by people who spoke of duty and never of passion. When you looked at me at the altar, I didn't see a duke. I saw a man who was burning with a love he was too afraid to name. And in that moment, I realized I would rather burn with you than be safe with anyone else." Cillian turned, his gray eyes searching hers. The distance he had spent months maintaining vanished. He reached out, his large hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing against her dark hair. "I cannot promise you a quiet life, Genevieve. I cannot promise that the ghosts of my past won't come knocking again. But I can promise you this, no one will ever love you with the ferocity that I do. I am a man of fire and shadows, and if you stay with me, I will give you everything I am." He leaned down, and this time, the kiss was not a performance for a congregation. It was a seal of a new covenant, one where the Red Duke and his black raven would face the world together. But as they held each other, a soft knock came at the door. It was the butler, his face ashen. "Your Grace. I am sorry to disturb you, but there is a man at the kitchen entrance." He says he is from the Kildare estates. He says the child's mother did not die of fever. He says she was taken. And that the men who took her are now in London, looking for what you stole from them. The fire in the hearth flickered, and the cold of the London night seemed to seep through the walls once again. The mystery was deepening, and the loveless marriage they had planned was now a battle for survival that had only just begun. The velvet shadows of the master suite at Rathmore House seemed to pulsate with the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that felt like a countdown to an inevitable collision. Genevieve stood by the window, her raven hair cascading over her shoulders like a silken waterfall, reflecting the amber glow of the dying fire. Beside her, Cillian was a silhouette of restless energy. The revelation from the butler, that his sister had been taken, not killed by sickness, had stripped away the last of his ducal composure. The Red Duke was gone. In his place stood a man of war, his jaw set in a line of jagged iron, his stormy eyes scanning the dark street below as if expecting an army to emerge from the London fog. "They are here, Genevieve," Cillian whispered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The men from the shadowlands of Kildare. They don't want gold, and they don't want titles. They want the silence that only comes with the grave." He turned to her, the firelight catching the vibrant copper of his hair, making it look like a crown of embers. "My sister, Siobhan, she knew where the bodies were buried. Not just metaphorically. She had proof of a conspiracy involving the land seizures that built half the fortunes in the city. I thought I was protecting her by sending her away, by becoming the monster the English society wanted me to be. But my success only made her a bigger target." Genevieve didn't flinch. She stepped into his personal space, her presence a cool balm to his burning rage. "Then we stop hiding behind these marble walls, Cillian. You spent months pretending you were a man without a heart to keep me safe from yourself. Now, use that heart to fight for what remains of your family." She reached up, her fingers grazing the rough stubble on his chin. "We have the child. We have Mary. And we have the truth. If they are in London, they are on my territory now. The Cavendish name may be broke, but it has ears in every corner of this city, from the gutters of Cheapside to the drawing rooms of the palace." The rest of the night was a fevered dream of preparations. Cillian summoned his most trusted men, soldiers he had served with in Spain, men who cared nothing for titles and everything for the man who had led them through hell. They gathered in the darkened library, the scent of gun oil and old leather replacing the floral notes of the wedding day. Cillian stood at the head of the table, a map of London spread before him. He pointed to the docks of Wapping. "This is where they'll be. It's the only place men with that kind of filth on their hands can disappear. They'll be waiting for a ship to take the evidence, and the boy, back to Ireland to be silenced forever." "And what of the woman?" Genevieve asked, entering the room. She had traded her silver wedding gown for a riding habit of midnight blue, her dark hair pulled back in a practical, severe braid. "If Siobhan was taken, she is still alive. They wouldn't kill her until they were sure they had everything she hid. A dead woman can't tell you where the ledgers are." Cillian looked at his wife, a mixture of pride and terror in his eyes. "Genevieve, you cannot come. This isn't a ballroom. This is a slaughterhouse." "I am the Duchess of Rathmore," she replied, her voice echoing with a steel that made the soldiers in the room straighten their backs. "And if you think I am staying here to wait for a messenger to tell me if I am a widow or a wife, you haven't been paying attention, Cillian. I told you I would rather burn with you. I meant it." Under the cover of a moonless sky, the party moved toward the East End. The opulence of Mayfair gave way to the rotting timber and salt-choked air of the Thames. They moved like ghosts through the narrow alleys, the only sound the distant tolling of a buoy and the lapping of the black water against the piers. Cillian led the way, his red hair tucked under a dark cap, his hand never straying from the hilt of his blade. They reached a dilapidated warehouse, its windows boarded up like blinded eyes. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and damp wood. A single lantern flickered on a crate, casting long, distorted shadows. In the center of the room, tied to a chair, was a woman. Her hair, though matted with dirt and blood, was the same fiery copper as Cillian's. Siobhan. Standing over her was a man Genevieve recognized from the outskirts of the church, the messenger who had spoken of what was stolen. "It's a long way from the House of Lords, isn't it, Your Grace?" the man sneered as Cillian stepped into the light. "Did you bring the boy? Or do we start removing fingers from the lady here until you remember where your loyalties lie?" Cillian's response was not a word, but a movement so fast it was almost a blur. He lunged forward, the roar of a man who had finally found the source of his pain. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel, and the sounds of a desperate struggle filled the cavernous space. Genevieve didn't stay back. She saw a man aiming a pistol at Cillian's back and, without a second thought, she threw a heavy iron lantern at his head, the glass shattering and distracting him long enough for Cillian to finish the fight. In the aftermath, the warehouse was silent once more, save for the heavy breathing of the survivors. Cillian knelt beside his sister, his hands trembling as he cut her bonds. Siobhan collapsed into his arms, weeping silently. He held her with a tenderness that broke Genevieve's heart, his red hair mingling with hers in a tangled web of shared history and suffering. "I have you," Cillian whispered, his voice cracking. "I have you, Siobhan. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you." He looked up at Genevieve, who stood in the shadows, her dark hair disheveled, her blue habit stained with soot. In that moment, the loveless marriage they had negotiated was a distant, ridiculous memory. They were no longer a duke and a duchess playing at roles, they were two souls who had crossed through fire to find a truth worth holding on to. As they emerged from the warehouse into the gray light of dawn, the Thames was beginning to shimmer with the first hints of gold. Cillian walked to Genevieve, his sister supported by one of his men. He took Genevieve's face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "The world will still come for us, Genevieve. The king, the scandal, the ledgers, it isn't over." "Let them come," she said, leaning into his touch, her raven hair catching the morning light. "The Red Duke and his Duchess have a story to tell. And I think London is finally ready to hear the truth." The carriage waited at the end of the pier. As they climbed in, Cillian pulled her close, his heart beating a steady, fierce rhythm against hers. The promise made at the altar had been stunned everyone, but the life they were about to build would be the true legend. The golden dawn over the River Thames did not bring peace, but a clarity that was as sharp and cold as a duelist's blade. As the carriage carrying the Duke, the Duchess, and the rescued Siobhan rattled back toward Mayfair, the city of London began to wake, unaware that the foundations of its social hierarchy had been shaken to the core. Genevieve watched the light catch the strands of Cillian's red hair, which now seemed less like a warning of danger and more like a beacon of hope. He held his sister's hand with a fierce protectiveness, his gaze never straying far from Genevieve. They had survived the warehouse, but the drawing rooms of Carlton House remained the most dangerous battlefield of all. "We cannot simply return to Rathmore House and hide," Genevieve said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "Castlereagh and his ilk are like wolves, they smell blood, and they will interpret our silence as guilt. We must strike first, Cillian. We must present the truth before they can manufacture a lie that sticks." Cillian nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "Siobhan has the ledgers, Genevieve. They weren't in Ireland, she had them sewn into the lining of her cloak the entire time. They contain the names of every lord and minister who profited from the illegal seizure of the Kildare lands. It's not just my reputation at stake, it's the integrity of the Regency itself. He looked at his sister, who was resting against the cushions. I spent years trying to be the man they wanted, the Red Duke, a loyal soldier who asked no questions. But a duke is nothing if he does not protect his own. By midday, Rathmore House was transformed. Cillian's soldiers guarded every entrance, their presence a silent deterrent to any further attempts on their lives. Genevieve, despite having had no sleep, took charge with a brilliance that left the staff in awe. She sent out urgent invitations for a grand post-wedding breakfast to be held that very evening. It was a bold, almost suicidal move. To invite the very people who were whispering about your downfall was to walk directly into the lion's den. They will come, Genevieve told Cillian as they stood in the grand ballroom, the floor polished to a mirror-like shine. Curiosity is the strongest vice of the ton. They want to see the wreckage of our marriage. They want to see the Black Raven in tears and the Red Duke in chains. Instead, we will give them a revelation they will never forget. As the sun began to set, the carriages arrived in a steady stream. The elite of London filed into the ballroom, their eyes darting, their fans fluttering with the latest gossip. Lord Castlereagh was among the first to arrive, his expression one of bored expectation. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a palpable electricity that made the hair on the back of Genevieve's neck stand up. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, the Rathmore color, and the famous emeralds around her neck felt like a weight of responsibility she was now proud to carry. Cillian stood beside her, his red hair brushed back, his dress uniform pristine. When the room was full, he stepped forward, not toward the throne of the Prince Regent, but toward the center of the crowd. The music stopped. The whispers died. "My lords and ladies," Cillian's voice rang out, vibrating with a power that commanded absolute silence. "Many of you came here today expecting a scandal. You heard words at the altar that confused you, and you saw ghosts from my past that frightened you. I promised my wife a marriage without love, and I promised this society a duke without a past. I was wrong on both counts." He gestured to the balcony, where Siobhan stood, dressed in fine silk, holding the infant Mary had brought to the church. "This is my sister, Cillian O'Shea. She was not a victim of fever, but of greed. She was taken by men who sought to hide the truth of how many of the fortunes in this room were truly made." A murmur of shock and fear rippled through the guests. Cillian held up a small, leather-bound book. "These are the ledgers of Kildare. They contain the names of those who traded lives for land. I could hand this to the king, or I could burn it. But I have decided that the Duke of Rathmore will no longer be a man of secrets." Cillian looked directly at Castlereagh. "The child is my heir until Genevieve and I are blessed with our own. He will carry the Rathmore name with the honor it deserves. And as for my marriage..." He turned to Genevieve, his eyes softening in a way that stunned everyone who had ever called him the Ice Duke. He took her hand and knelt before her, right there in the center of the ballroom. "I told you I had no heart to give, Genevieve. But the truth is, you didn't need me to give it to you. You claimed it the moment you stood by me in the dark. You are not just my Duchess, you are my soul. And I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure the world knows it." The scandal didn't break them, it made them legends. Castlereagh and his conspirators retreated into the shadows, knowing the ledgers remained a silent threat, a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. The Loveless marriage became the greatest romance of the decade. Years later, the gardens of Rathmore House would ring with the laughter of children, some with hair as black as midnight, others with the fiery copper of their father. Cillian and Genevieve would often be seen walking through the mist of their estate, no longer needing words to bridge the distance. The Duke had promised a loveless marriage, but in the end, he had given her a fire that would never go out. They had faced the altar, the warehouse, and the king, and they had emerged not just as a title, but as a force of nature. The Red Duke and his Black Raven had turned a cold contract into a burning reality, proving that even the most calculated bargain can be undone by a single, honest heartbeat. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world.